Thank you. It's a real pleasure and an honor to be here giving the Pufendorf lectures. Today I'm going to read a lecture because it's, although it's on a theme that I've been developing, it's really the first time that I've gone through some of the pluses and minuses in what I feel is some detail, and I wanted to make sure that I could say them correctly. Next meeting, I think, depends a lot less on the right formulations and more on the ideas. So tomorrow I won't be reading, but today I do want to read to try and get it as right as possible. Doesn't mean they're intricate arguments. It just means that it took me a bit of time to make sure I was saying the right things. Now, whether you are in the US, the UK, or the Nordic countries, or the World Bank, if you are a policymaker or an analyst, you will be urged, indeed usually mandated, to pursue evidence-based policy. I think you're not so much mandated in the Nordic countries, but certainly you're urged, and there's a very active Campbell collaboration for the Nordic countries, which is really pushing evidence-based policy. Now, as a recent report commissioned for the UK Department for International Development explains, the search for what works, hence for a demonstration of the causal basis of interventions for the production of desired effects, is at the basis of the movement for evidence-based policy. I forgot, there is Title I. This movement argues that policymakers should take decisions based on evidence rather than on ideology or in response to special issues. Interests, sorry. That's the end of the quote from Diffid. Now, if evidence is going to play this crucial role in improving policy, we had better be clear just what evidence is. And that's what this first lecture is about. I will focus on evidence for effectiveness predictions, predictions that a well-defined policy will produce a targeted outcome here for us if we implement it. Randomized controlled trials, or RCTs, are touted as gold standard evidence for such claims. But there is a catch, and one that the evidence-based policy community is worried about. And I'm quoting now from one of the spokespeople for the movement. There is a risk that with concentration on or assumed superiority of experimental or quasi-experimental methods, approaches will come to be considered less effective or somehow inferior. Interventions not suitable for these approaches will come to be considered less effective or somehow inferior and therefore less value for money. So that's the worry. So it is asked, can non-experimental and qualitative evidence support effectiveness predictions? How and how strongly? Now, I shall argue that this way of raising the questions already takes far too much for granted. I propose we start much further back by asking, what makes RCTs evidence for effectiveness in the first place? What makes them evidence at all? My first two lectures offer an answer to this question. I start by proposing a theory of evidence that answers this question, a theory of what makes one fact evidence for another. This theory goes by the label, as you see here, the argument theory of evidence, and it's not original with me. It's just I've resurrected it because I think it's the right theory for these problems. So tomorrow, I shall move specifically to RCTs, illustrating the argument theory of evidence and applying it to figure out when they can, that is, when RCTs can count as evidence for effectiveness claims. This will involve us in a discussion of what I call causal roles. RCTs are most useful when the causal role that the policy plays in the study setting is one that it can play widely. This is in part what can be meant by ascribing a causal power, or in my language, a capacity, to the policy. The third lecture is about these kinds of causal powers, how they differ from and underwrite causal laws, and why they are so useful to us. The last lecture focuses on causal powers in what I call nomological machines, which can also underwrite causal laws. In this final lecture, I will take up an older topic of mine that I've returned to because many false hopes for policy effectiveness based on what is thought to be excellent evidence come from ignoring lessons about the underlying structures or the nomological machines. The discussion of nomological machines will return us to issues of RCTs and their evidentiary power. What causal role a policy plays depends on what nomological machine is at work. RCTs thus typically provide evidence of effectiveness in new sites only if the behaviors in the new site and in the experimental site arise from the same underlying structure or nomological machine. Okay, so let us turn to the question for today. What is evidence? More specifically, under what conditions is one empirical claim E evidence for a second empirical claim H? I note from the start that evidence is not a natural kind. There is no correct theory of what evidence is, as there might be a correct theory of what an electron is. When this is the case, our account of what makes for a good theory should be responsive to what needs the theory addresses. The theory I propose started as a theory of evidence for use, in particular for use in making reliable predictions, especially predictions about what results will be produced by actions we consider taking. The argument account is not confined to this context, however, but should fit anywhere we face the same needs, including the warranting of empirical claims by scientific methods. A central problem I see everywhere that evidence-based policy is on the tapis is that the way the term evidence is used lets in far too much. And it does so while at the same time purporting to be very restrictive by subscribing to the highest standards of rigor. In response, my theory of evidence is demanding. That is because I agree with a common supposition. It is common and I think reasonably supposed that a piece of evidence for a hypothesis should weigh in favor of the truth of that hypothesis. It is with this in mind that I offer stringent criteria. I want criteria such that once a fact meets those criteria, we are right to allow it a place on the scale. My criteria rule out as evidence much that is currently lauded in evidence-based policy discussions, and that is all to the good, I shall argue. So here is the central tenet of my theory of oops, it's all come on at once. Well, doesn't matter. The central tenet of my theory of evidence is that if you aren't doing arguments, you aren't doing evidence. Okay? And so, evidence equals facts recorded in good arguments, and it's not evidence unless there's evidence that it's evidence. Okay. Now, how do I get to the doctrine summed up in these slogans? I start with the observation that for evidence about the truth, that for evidence that a hypothesis is true, we need true claims, that is, they have weight themselves, that, in accord with my desideratum, matter to the truth of the hypothesis. So, no claim is evidence for H unless it genuinely weighs in favor of H's truth. That, I claim, is always a conditional matter. Evidence is not a three-place relation. E is evidence for H. It is rather it's not a two-place relation. It's rather a three-place relation. So it's not E is evidence for H, but rather E is evidence for H relative to A. Okay. And what's A? A is a good argument. So here's my proposal. There we are. This is the proposal actually written, not in a slogan anymore. The argument theory of evidence maintains that empirical claim E is evidence for empirical claim H relative to argument A. That's the only concept that makes sense to define in this context. And it's relative, and it is evidence relative to argument A, or relative to a sequence of arguments. If and only if E is a premise in A, which is a good argument for H, or E is a premise in A prime, which is a good argument for a premise in a good argument A for H, etc., etc., etc. Okay, where a good argument is valid and sound. Okay, the premises are true and the conclusion genuinely follows from them. Now, I am inclined to suppose that validity is characteristic only of deductive arguments, where true premises ensure true conclusions. But I'd be happy to go along with some kind of inductive logic if you can show me that it will also serve the purpose. But I'm going to talk about deductive logics. Okay. Now, two parallel lines of defense support the argument theory, okay, of evidence. One ontological, the other epistemological. And that's because evidence is Janus-faced. On the one hand, it has to do with the truth, with truth and truth trackers, with what facts there are and what other facts can ensure these obtain. I should note here, though, that I take a generous view of what facts include. In particular, facts can be expressed by general claims, like Maxwell's equations, or the claims of the general theory of equilibrium in economics, as well as by singular claims like the cat is on the mat. Okay. On the other hand, evidence has to do with our attempts to arrive at truths, with our hypotheses about what facts obtain and the further hypotheses that provide warrant for them. The two lines of reasoning are obverse sides of the same coin, one expressed, to use Rudolf Carnap's terminology, in the material mode, and the other in the formal mode. Okay. Let's begin with ontology. Okay. Facts have logical relations, and nature must willy-nilly be consistent. So some facts or sets of facts are sufficient for others. If the first obtains, the second cannot fail to obtain. Or perhaps there are objective probabilifying relations in nature, and I'll come to these much later. Okay. So that's one fact then. One fact F sub E is evidence for a second F sub H. Then if Fe is a necessary member of a set of facts sufficient to ensure Fh obtains. Okay. Note that sufficient to ensure X obtains is not the same as brings about X. It means just what it says. The one set cannot obtain if the other fails. Now, if you were brought up in the tradition of Hempel and Nagel, as I was, you may well be more comfortable with the formal mode version of the parallel lines of defense. Evidence for a claim is supposed to contribute to warrant for the truth of the claim. What contributes to warrant for the truth of a claim are reasons. And what makes some claim E a reason for another H is that E figures in a good argument for H. And good here equals valid and sound. The premises are true and the conclusion genuinely follows from them. Okay. Deduction provides a clear sense to what it means for a conclusion to follow from a set of premises. It is the formal mode counterpart to one set of facts being sufficient in nature to ensure that a second obtains. Okay. So the demand that an evidence claim figure in an argument, a good argument, valid and sound, may seem strong. I actually make a stronger demand when it comes to practice. Not only should there be a good argument from E to H if E is evidence for H, but we should not count E as evidence until that argument is displayed. Okay, that's a very strong ideal, but I'd really like to urge that we approximate it. This is part of what I intend with the slogan, "It's not evidence till there's evidence that it's evidence." Of course, I mean, that's just a truism given the argument theory of evidence, but I mean to stress it that we should display the argument. C.G. Hempel's account of explanation also, Hempel's account of explanation, it also demanded validity, okay, and it also majored on deductive arguments. Hempel, though, allowed that many good explanations in science are enthematic. In particular, they are often not completely laid out. Now, when it comes to evidence for scientific claims or policy predictions, I think that can be a mistake. Both science and evidence-based policy get their grand status in part from their claims to rigor. And as a way to ensure rigor, nothing beats laying out the arguments and looking to see how good they are. Okay, so let's skip all of that. Okay, I stress the importance of arguments because arguments, like chains, are only as strong as their weakest link. A valid argument, this is all trivial for you folks, a valid argument with 9 premises known to be true and 1 known to be false does not make its conclusion 90% probable. So a body of evidence that nails down 9 of 10 premises is not enough for warrant. Indeed, if the 10th premise is known to be false, okay, the argument is no good at all. And what's been offered as evidence is irrelevant to the truth of the conclusion. Hence my third slogan, it's not evidence till there's evidence, it's evidence. This means that for good practice, you should not count E as evidence for H without good reason. That is, good reason that supports that it appears as a necessary premise in a good argument for H. Okay. Let's see, yes. Of course, you can bet that there is such an argument without having a clue what it is. You're betting, though. That's not evidence-based policy. Or you can, in good conscience, agree that there is such an argument if an honest expert assures you she has such an argument to hand. But the standards of rigor and explicitness on which science and evidence-based policy base their reputations require more. They require the display of the argument. Hiding what it takes to flesh out the argument is not only poor science, it is, I think, morally culpable. So I advocate the use of what I call argument pyramids. I'm going to illustrate this. Mystery stories provide good examples of the importance of each and every premise throughout the argument structure. And I'm also going to illustrate, using a mystery, the importance of the arguments for each of the premises, as well as what an argument pyramid looks like. Consider Freeman Wills Croft's Inspector French, who is always at pains to lay out clearly the arguments that support his conclusions. In one of my favorite stories, Inspector French has become convinced, on the basis of a body of seemingly good evidence, that Carey murdered Ackerley. We can reconstruct his warrant for this in the form that I advocate, okay, that of an argument with explicit premises and explicit sub-premises, diagrammed in an argument pyramid that looks like this. Premise 1 in French's argument concerns motive. Ackerley, French argued, had cottoned on to a major fraud that Carey was involved in. This was backed by compelling evidence for 3 claims. Fraud had been committed, Ackerley had raised suspicions about it, and Carey was responsible for the fraud. Okay. This last was supported by evidence that Carey was in a position to perpetrate the fraud, that he had income otherwise unaccounted for, and, very importantly, that he had committed suicide when it looked as if the fraud might be revealed, despite Ackerley's death. Okay. Now, there was equally good evidence for premise 2 concerning opportunity. Carey could have committed the crime. I won't tell the whole story. The check mark. Oh, they're missing. Goodness. There's supposed to be check marks in all these boxes, and they've somehow disappeared. Okay, so the check marks that aren't there are supposed to, mean the check marks that aren't there would mean that French had good reasons to back his claim about Carey's opportunity. But opportunity and motive by themselves do not support a conclusion of guilt. French, though, had a third premise. Premise 3, they're in the next picture. In fact, I think this picture wasn't, no, okay. The picture is in my notes and doesn't seem to be in the slides. That's the problem. The picture that's in my notes isn't the same as the one in the slides. Sorry. Anyway, you've got the point. You fill in these check marks. Okay. Now, let's go back, though, to where we were. So we've got some of the boxes filled in, okay? But opportunity and motive by themselves do not support a conclusion of guilt. French, though, had a third premise. Premise 3 laid out the method. This was a step-by-step narrative of how Carey was supposed to have carried out the murder. This narrative was supported by good evidence that Carey was at some of the right places at the right times, and French had established by time. This is one of those nice stories where everything is timed to the last minute to see if you could be here or there at the right times. Okay, so French had established by timing distances and estimating speeds, Carey could have been at the other places in the chain when needed. French had a way to fill in all the boxes in the argument pyramid all the way down. Okay, but I won't do so. Wait, you know, if I don't find this other slide, you're going to be really puzzled. Let's see if it's not. Nope, sorry, it's just not there. So, okay. I'll have to explain to you what the slide should have. The slide is meant to have little roots coming out of the bottom of these, and then I'm going to explain the roots to you in a little bit. So it's supposed to have checks. By the time we're finished, it has checks all the way through and little roots coming out of the bottom. Okay. Now, as I say, Carey had a way to fill in all the boxes in the argument pyramid all the way down. But I won't do so since you don't want to hear about the mystery, you want to hear the philosophy. Okay. Together, French's three major premises made a compelling argument for Carey's guilt. Okay, so those three. Then it was revealed that Carey had not committed suicide, but rather was murdered. French immediately reported this to his superior. And here's a record of their conversation, beginning with a question from French's superior. Okay. This is going to mean an upset to your theory, Inspector? French nodded. Complete. I've got to start from the beginning again. Is it that as bad as that? I think so. This murder of Carey makes it unlikely that he killed Ackerley. And if he didn't kill Ackerley, the whole of my theory goes west. So the whole theory fails. There is no longer compelling reason to think that Carey murdered Ackerley. But what about all that evidence French had painstakingly gathered? Well, it was no longer evidence at all. It was no longer evidence that Carey was the killer. Without the premise that Carey committed suicide, you can't move on, because the suicide was an essential prop for the assumption that Carey was responsible for the fraud. Okay? And without the suicide, the other evidence is too weak to justify this assumption. And without motive, opportunity, and the existence of a possible method for carrying out the murder, without motive, opportunity, and the possibility of having opportunity and method are not enough to support the conclusion that Carey was the murderer. It's still possible that he was guilty, okay, but French no longer has evidence to support that. Evidence is a three-place relation. The measurements of distances and times are evidence of Carey's guilt, yes, but only relative to French's entire argument. When one of the necessary premises in that argument fails, those measurements are no longer evidence at all. As French says, his whole theory goes west, as in this picture. Okay. Now, so that's an illustration of an argument pyramid and the argument theory of evidence. There are a number of immediate objections one might have to the argument account of evidence. None, I believe, undermine the account, but let's look at some of these. On this account, given my demand that it's not evidence till there's evidence it's evidence, the job of warranting a claim can never be finished. Warranting a claim requires warranting the premises of a good argument for it. And to do that, you need warrant for premises and another argument for each premise in the first argument, and so on. So, warrant never ends, it seems. Well, yes, that's what follows on the argument theory of evidence. But it does not seem to me a problem. That's what life is like. Right? It's what good, honest evaluation requires. Of course, we do stop somewhere. We have to. And that's what I was going to say if you noticed. No. So they're supposed to be. Back to the picture, there we are. There's supposed to be roots growing out of the bottom of these, okay? And what the roots growing out of the bottom boxes in the diagram of French's argument pyramid, what they're supposed to indicate is that the claims on the bottom are taken as well established. To the extent that our stopping points are not ones we can take for granted, at least for the nonce, we must be wary of our conclusions. That's why it can be worthwhile to have a variety of different plausible defenses for the same conclusion. Okay, so let's get back to where we were here. Objection 1. Okay. Now, we all know from Otto Neurath that in reasoning we are like sailors who must repair our boats at sea without ever putting into dry dock to build from firm foundations. So we will always have to trust to some claims we take as true, at least for the nonce. But we should not make our situations worse by neglecting our argument pyramids. Without laying out all the premises and all the arguments, we don't know how leaky our boat is. Okay. So that's objection 1, and I don't find it objectionable. I think to have a different view is simply to make a mistake about the metaphor of the sailors at sea. That is quite right. Okay. Now, the second objection is that the argument account implies a number of what might be thought oddities, and to all of which I have the same answer. Yes, these facts are indeed evidence, though they may not be evidence that's very useful for us. Okay, so let's look at these in turn. Anything true is evidence for a logical truth. Any claim at all is a premise and a good argument for a logical truth, so anything is evidence for a logical truth. Okay? Yes, and so it should be. Anything is evidence for a logical truth. Still, I wouldn't advise spending much to buy information about other facts in order to warrant a logical truth. If you know a claim is a logical truth, you don't need to buy information about other facts to warrant it. And if you don't know that the claim is a logical truth, okay, you will have trouble warranting that the claim is implied by the fact you buy. Still, if I don't know H is a logical truth, but I am assured by you, who are an expert, that if E then H, then E is surely worth learning, okay, even if H is a logical truth. Okay, so that's the first. The second is that things like A and B is evidence for A, arrow B and A is evidence for B, etc. Yes, they are. But we know that conclusions of arguments are no more warranted by the argument than the premises. So we're not going to be led astray here in evaluating the warrant for a claim. Okay. Third, everything is evidence for itself. That's okay too. Any claim does speak for itself. Again, though, we know that conclusions of arguments are no more warranted by the argument than the premises, so we won't be led astray here either. Okay. So that's objection 2. Now there's a third objection. The argument account employs a flawed theory of relevance. It lets in as evidentially relevant just the kinds of things philosophers have been at pains to rule out. And then this kind of complicated example I'm going to give. But first let's consider the canonical example. So the canonical example is John Jones takes birth control pills. Surely this is not evidence for his non-pregnancy. Okay? But I think, to the contrary, that it's excellent evidence. Okay. Look at the argument. Nobody who takes birth controls gets pregnant. John, well, it's not really true, but that's the assumption. John Jones takes birth control pills, therefore John Jones does not get pregnant. Given 1, 2 speaks, and speaks compellingly for 3's truth. What better basis could the truth of 3 have? To suppose that John Jones's taking birth control pills is not evidence for his failure to get pregnant is to conflate evidence and explanation. And that's just a mistake. Okay. Now, another objection is that if all arguments are deductive, then a number of things that might seem odd follow. Now, the first one is that there can't be both evidence for a claim and evidence for its negation, because evidence claims must be able to participate in good deductive arguments, and there can't be good deductive arguments for a hypothesis and its negation. Okay? That's okay too. It can still be reasonable to say we have evidence for H and evidence for not H when there are results that can figure in plausible arguments for H and results that can figure in plausible arguments for its opposite. That's just what we say, right? When we don't know. What matters is that we recognize that the results can only count as evidence relative to some good argument, so that we don't just let the result weigh in without commitment to the existence of these arguments. Of course, if there are good arguments that are not deductive, and hence the truth of the premises does not guarantee the truth of the conclusion, then it may be literally true that there is evidence both for H and evidence for not H on the argument account of evidence. But again, that is as it should be. Okay. Another objection is there can be no evidence for false claims. As soon as you know there is evidence for H by lights of the argument theory, you know that H is true. Right? Again, that seems to me no problem. The problem is coming to know that E is evidence for H. Okay? This is a serious job, and one of my concerns with the evidence-based policy literature, as I shall explain tomorrow, is that it does not take the job seriously enough, all the while boasting that that is just what it does do. Okay. Now, although I don't think our ordinary locutions count for much in efforts like mine to make precise an everyday concept like evidence so that it can serve specific scientific purposes, I'll just note that often we do use the term evidence in a way that supposes there's no evidence for false claims. If I am accused of cooking the books or murdering Ackerley, I might very well respond, but you couldn't have evidence for that. I didn't do it. Okay. So, okay. Anyway, that's, I think, enough on objections for the moment. In my final section, I should like to compare the argument account with one other, that of Sherry Rausch. I mean, I should also talk about Peter Achenstein as well and his explanatory relevance account of evidence. But I have done this in print elsewhere, and so I won't rehearse all that here, but do the new thing with Rausch. Now, I pick Rausch and Achenstein as the two relevant folks to comment on here. Achenstein because he's been worried about evidence for a very, very long time, and very strangely, when he was starting writing 30, 40 years ago, philosophers of science didn't talk about evidence, and nobody talked about evidence except Peter Achenstein and followers of his. You know, suddenly now we recognize that it's a topic that we've been neglecting. Okay, so that's Achenstein, and Sherry Rausch, I think, has thought very deeply and has very interesting and useful things to say about evidence. Okay, but it's not just that they're both very interesting that I pick these two. I pick them because they are concerned, as am I, with a theory of what counts as evidence, what facts ensure others are true, not a theory about our entitlement to make, endorse, or use fact claims. Okay. So the other major alternatives besides, I think, Achenstein and Rausch, you might know lots of others that I'm just not familiar with or have forgotten about, but the other major alternatives besides these two characterize evidence using probabilities and push come to shove, their probabilities must be subjective, degrees of belief. So, okay, so let's see where we are. So evidence in the sense supposed in evidence-based policy and in the sense required, evidence in the sense supposed in evidence-based policy and in the sense required for establishing scientific hypotheses has nothing to do with belief. Okay? It has to do with the truth of empirical claims and with other facts that ensure that truth. So subjective probabilities have no place in the characterization of evidence for these purposes. Though, of course, they may, if there are any such things as subjective probabilities, okay, they may play a legitimate role when it comes to our estimates of whether one claim is evidence for another. But they certainly, subjective beliefs should have nothing to do with characterizing whether one fact is evidence for another. So I'm going to discuss some of my objections to probability definitions of evidence. The first is that, as I say, evidence doesn't equal justification of belief. Okay, that's what we've just done. Now, second is that even where one is concerned with justifying belief, so it's not the concern of the kind of theory of evidence that I'm looking for evidence-based policy, the kind of theory, objective theory of evidence that I think matters for in looking for evidence for scientific claims. Okay. But if you are concerned with justifying belief, I don't think it's appropriate to characterize evidence in terms of subjective probability, okay? Because that puts the cart before the horse. Okay? Degrees of belief must come from somewhere. And if we're anywhere in the neighborhood of rationality and science, reasonable decision making, the degrees of belief should hopefully come from rational consideration. So take the probability of H given E. Okay? The rational way to settle on a value for the probability of H given E is to consider whether E is evidence for H and how good it is as evidence. And then that would help you figure out how much probability, right, E confers on H. Okay? But then that requires some account of what makes E evidence for H independent of our subjective probability for E on H. So I think just that all these attempts to use probabilities, subjective probabilities to characterize evidence, they not only fail because, for me, because they're not characterizing the sense of evidence that we need to get a grip on for science and policy, but also they just don't do the job even when you're interested in justifying belief. Okay, so let's turn to Rausch. Like me, she is keen to keep the enterprise of theory of knowledge and the enterprises of theory of knowledge and theory of evidence separate. And I'm quoting from her now. The notions of evidence that I am aiming for are objective in the following sense: that E is evidence for H is understood as holding in virtue of a factual relation between the statement E is being true and the statement H is being true, not in virtue of anyone's believing that this relation exists. And that's the end of the quote from Sherry. Her basic idea is this, and I'm quoting her again: intuitively, good evidence for a hypothesis is a discriminating indicator of the truth of the hypothesis. And that's the end of the quote. Now, a discriminating indicator for her means some appropriate probabilistic analog of H is true if H is true if E is true, and false if E is false. That is H if and only if E. Okay. Now, formally, Rausch's account of evidence requires that for good evidence, the probability of H given E is high. Okay. And in order to satisfy what she calls the leverage condition, Rausch in addition requires that the likelihood ratio be greater than 1. And moreover, she adds that it's highly desirable that the probability of the evidence claim is high. Now, there are a number of reasons that I do not adopt Rausch's account, hinging primarily on the fact that it is still too much of a hybrid between an account of evidence, just the objective account that she herself wants, and an account of how to justify our claims to knowledge, which she claims she's not discussing. Okay? The first place that our accounts part company is over what Rausch calls Bayesianism. I think she has a non-standard use of Bayesianism, but at any rate, here's what she means by it. For her, this does not mean a subjective interpretation of probability. So she uses probabilities, she thinks they're objective, okay? Rather, and I'm quoting from her, the Bayesian makes the idealizing assumption that all statements of the language in question possess probabilities. This is in contrast to the approach of classical statistics, in which it is denied, for instance, that hypotheses have probabilities. That's Rausch. Okay. Now, for the objective notion of evidence that Rausch and I both have in view, though, it cannot be probabilities of statements that matter, but rather probabilities of facts. And I do not see that there generally are such objective probabilities. Probabilities for facts arise from chance setups, which are a special kind of, well, what I'm going to talk about in the last lecture, nomological machines. And while nomological machines are not all that rare, those that count as chance setups appear to be a small subset. Okay. So I don't think that objective probabilities are all that widespread, and certainly not as widespread as evidence is. Okay. Then I disagree with each of Rausch's conditions in turn. Okay. First, P of E is high. Rausch insists on this in a debate about whether evidence should be surprising, which many, Bayesians especially, require. Now, her discussion at this point repeatedly refers to degrees of belief, despite the fact that she is embarked on an objective theory of evidence, but suddenly you find her talking, the whole discussion is in terms of degrees of belief. Okay? And I think that's a clue that she reverts to degrees of belief. If we are thinking about license to accept H, there are a variety of reasons to value observing consequences of H that were not expected beforehand, surprising evidence. Okay? Like worries about accommodation, rather than novel prediction, or the demand that H have content that goes beyond summarizing what's already known. So there are reasons when you're thinking of our knowledge claims to want evidence to be surprising. But notice that I say here not expected beforehand, right? That has to do with subjective probabilities and our claims for knowledge, which are not relevant to the objective notion of evidence. On the objective side, E should be true, not objectively probable. High probability of E only comes in as a demand when we consider whether we should accept that E is evidence. Consider an example. Okay. So I wanted to, I'm trying to think about this and whether, how to illustrate it. So I tried to find a case where I actually believe there's a chance there might be objective probabilities. Since I'm probably at the limiting end of thinking there aren't many objective probabilities, if I think there might be some here, I assume that this might be a good example for the rest of you. Say you have 3 coins. The first coin, for the first coin, the probability of heads is 0.2. Okay? For the second, the probability of heads is 1. That is, the second coin is 2-headed. Okay? And for the third coin, again, the probability of heads is 0.2. Okay? Now, imagine the following chance setup. And this is a chance setup that's going to be in place from time t1 through up to and including time t3. Okay? So what we do is at t1, at the first time, you flip coin 1 in a totally random way. Then at T2 you have choice. If coin 1 turned up heads, you flip coin 2. And if coin 1 turned up tails, you flip coin 3. And then what happens is that at 3, well, you flipped coin 1 and you're going to get heads for sure, or else you flip coin 2 and you'll get either heads or tails. Okay? Now, consider E. Okay? E is the claim that coin 1 shows heads at T2. I'm sorry, I used H in two different... good, I've got rid of the H's. H sometimes means heads and sometimes it means the hypothesis. So, okay. So the evidence claim now that I want to consider is coin 1 shows heads at T2. And H equals heads occurs at T3. Okay. Now, the probability of E is 0.2. And that's low. But E is compelling evidence for H, because if you get heads at time t, at time 2, you're going to flip the two-headed coin and you're going to end up with heads. Right? So E is compelling evidence for H. But it's got very low probability. Okay? Now what I want to underline is that it is compelling evidence not despite its low probability, but regardless of its probability. Even though E has an objective probability, that objective probability is irrelevant to its status as evidence. Okay? And that's what this example is supposed to show. Okay? Sorry. That's so. And the example, I don't think the claim is just confined to this example. I think it'll be true anytime you have a chance set up that the probability of the evidence claim has got nothing to do with whether it's evidence or not. Okay. So what would I say about this case? Here's what I would say, is that C1 shows heads at T2 is true, if true, is evidence not for H, which was under consideration, right, but for H prime, which is a claim about the objective probability of heads at T3. And it's evidence for the claim that the objective probability of heads at T3 is 0.2. Oops, I think I've got that back to front, don't I? Anyway, this I think is the right thing to say and is what follows on the argument account. Okay. Now, given E. Right. So the likelihood, that I think is my objection to P of E having to be high rather than E having to be true. Okay. So let's return to the points of difference. Okay. The third is leverage. Okay. Now, Rausch demands that the likelihood ratio is high, and this is an aid of what she calls leverage. She tells us, and I'm quoting, evidence provides leverage on the truth of claims about the world. Specifically, knowing that the evidence statement is true is usually a lot easier than knowing that the hypothesis statement is true. And we use the former to help us make progress on the latter, where we could not have made progress directly. End of quote. Okay, now Damien Fennell and I have elsewhere explained problems we have with thinking the likelihood ratio can provide leverage in the way that Rausch wants. Okay. But those are technical arguments and I won't rehearse them here, but rather what I want to do is just make the more general point that I've been making now for a bit. I don't see how to justify any condition that demands leverage for an objective notion of evidence. Okay. Suppose E, if true, is evidence for H. I agree there's no point in spending a lot of money to learn whether E is true or not as an aid to deciding whether H is true, when it is much cheaper to learn H directly. But that has nothing to do with whether E is evidence for H or not. It has to do with where we're going to put our efforts in trying to learn H. Okay. Again, that has really to do with knowledge and not with evidence, and not with the objective theory of evidence that Rausch is hunting for. Okay. The last thing is that she demands that the probability of H given E is high. Well, suppose this is so, that P is an objective probability and E is true. Then the objective probability of H is P of H equals P of H given E. And on the argument account, E is good evidence for this. That is, that P of H equals P of H given E. And that is so whether P of H is high or not, or whether P of H given E is high or not. Okay. For Rausch, okay, so I think that if P of H given E is high, P is an objective probability and E is true, then we have good evidence that P of H is high, right? Because we have a deductive argument that P of H is high from premises that are true. Okay. So I'm happy with that we have evidence that P of H is high. Okay. But for Rausch, these three facts are also evidence for H. Okay. Now, this is a case of purely objective probabilities. So I don't really quarrel with Rausch's assumption. I just think I wouldn't want to adopt it. You could add her stipulation as part of an objective count of evidence without, I think, doing damage to an account of being an account of objective account of evidence. But I think it would be misleading. I don't think we have evidence that H will obtain, just that it can, or might well. More precisely, that it has probability P of H of obtaining. Now, there may be no harm in adding Rausch's requirement to the argument account, but it will mean that there can be good evidence in the fully objective sense for false H's, not just evidence we mistakenly think is good. And if we do add this requirement, then evidence cannot provide the same assurance of the hypotheses as it does on my version of the argument account. Okay. Now, also note that this requirement would play a different role in the argument theory of evidence than it does in Rausch's. For Rausch, this requirement is part of what secures the relevance of E to H. On the argument account, that is secured by arguments linking E and H. And the demand for argument should be enforced here as elsewhere. Okay? We should still demand a good argument, valid and sound, for the claim that P of H equals whatever it is, that it's high. And we had a good argument for that. Okay. And you should then have, I think, not only a good argument for it, but the associated argument pyramid. Okay. Now, there's one further feature on which Rausch and I differ, but not, I think, disagree, and that's on discrimination. For Rausch, E should track H. Bracketing issues about probabilities, this means E should be true if and only if H is. That's what I mentioned at the beginning. Now, the argument account requires only, or the argument account as I've put it forward, requires only that H be true if E is. Now, one could perfectly well add Rausch's demand. Evidence, after all, even objective evidence, the notion of objective evidence, is not a natural kind with fixed criteria or a fixed extension. I do not wish to opt for Rausch's stronger notion, though, since it is far stronger than what seems supposed in the evidence-based policy literature and in the bulk of scientific cases that I am familiar with. In particular, it would undercut the claim that positive results in an ideal RCT are evidence for causal claims, since positive results imply a causal connection between treatment and outcome. Okay, so that's okay. The evidence implies the hypothesis. But negative results do not show that there is no causal connection. So if you accept this as an additional condition, you're going to rule out you're not even going to be starting to play the game that the evidence-based policy people are playing, and I don't think that's where their major mistakes are lying. Okay. So now, there's a summary of the differences between Rausch and me. This is enough for today. Next lecture, I will provide a detailed example that puts the argument theory of evidence to work. In particular, as I said, I'm going to put it to work to show how dramatically to improve the rules for practicing evidence-based policy. Now, recall my desideratum at the start for theory of evidence. Okay? A piece of evidence for a hypothesis should weigh for the truth of that hypothesis. Advocates of evidence-based policy are concerned with just this desideratum. They police what gets on the scale to weigh in favor of policy predictions. As I shall illustrate tomorrow, they allow on the scale, right, only claims that are as evidence only claims that are true, as in this picture, or very, very likely to be true. They stick in a bit of epistemology there, right? Okay. But they really want to allow on the scale as evidence only claims that are true, as in the picture. But truth is, I mean, that already follows from what I've been saying, but truth is not enough for evidence. Imagine you had available the entire encyclopedia of unified science that lists every feature there is, borrowing the one you're predicting. Okay. Now, that would not help you estimate whether your policy prediction is true or not. You need to know not only what facts are true, but which facts are relevant to the truth of your prediction. The evidence-based policy rules vet for truth, but they are a poor guide to relevance. That's my worry. I claim that we cannot just drop claims on the scale because they are true. They must be relevant, and their relevance depends. You can't just drop them on the scale. They're not on the scale just because they're true. Their relevance depends on these arguments. Okay, and it's only once the argument is secured, okay, that the evidence claim can be cut loose, as we see here, and fall on the scale. Okay. Only then can it weigh in on the prediction. Okay. So my closing thought is that, and I'm going to try to convince you of this next time, I claim that the argument theory of evidence has real bite, and it bites just where it should. Thank you.
All right, so thank you very much. I'm trying to understand your argument theory of evidence. So I just wonder what you would say to an example where it seems that you have evidence in an intuitive sense, but there seems not to be a deductive argument which would make it evidence in your sense. So let's take a case where you have the evidence is that John's fingerprints is on the crime scene. And the conclusion will be that John was there at the crime scene at the time of the crime.
I take it, I mean, I would only buy that if I were prepared to buy that, at least in this case, fingerprints couldn't have gotten there any other way. And if that's not a fact, then I think his fingerprints aren't evidence that he did it. So, and if it is a fact, I have a deductive argument. I mean, there is a deductive argument.
Yes, but usually there would be other ways the fingerprints could have.
Yeah, so then I think it's not evidence. I think it's possible evidence, and it's really only evidence that he did it.
Yeah.
That it's really only evidence that he did it if they couldn't have gotten there any other way. Now, it's of course, now what we've done is we focus your attention on just what you need to find out. Could they have gotten there any other way? And so it's a strong claim about the restrictions on what it takes to be evidence. It's not just evidence because it could be, or we think it might be, or it's the kind of thing that we typically call evidence in ordinary discussion, because that's a loose ordinary concept. It's
right, yeah.
Yeah.
So what would you say to a similar case where you have the weather report on TV indicating that it will be rain tomorrow? So that would be a case where a kind of similar case.
Exactly the same about all of them. That that it isn't evidence unless there's a deductive argument. That as soon as I bring your attention to the missing premises, if I tell you those premises are false, I think you'd be inclined with me to say, well, looked like evidence, but it isn't, right? So that's what I'd say about it. But the other thing I want to say is that even though I'm now appealing to your intuitions of what you'd say or what you'd think, I do want to keep stressing that I think intuitions are about what you'd say or what you'd think is a bad way to do philosophy, or at least in these areas, because what we're dealing with are these ordinary language concepts that serve a number of roles and work in a number of different ways, and they're not precise enough to use in genuine scientific or policy contexts, and so we need to, as people say, precisify, make them precise in some way or another. This is a way of making them precise that I think does just the job we need, which is to provide a story about objective theory of evidence, and that has points you to just what you ought to be doing, which is before you claim it's evidence, look to see whether the missing premises are actually true.
I have a quick follow-up. May I take that one? So, can I interpret you as delivering an explication of evidence in Carnap's sense? I mean, you're giving a kind of a reconstructed notion of evidence which is supposed to be fruitful and more precise and so on, and the fruits of this will be seen later. Is that the way you're thinking about this?
Well, I think that the proof of it isn't seen later. The proof of it, well, I mean, it is seen in the fact that it does the jobs that I think need doing. There to provide a theory of evidence that that is the right kind of theory to be using an evidence-based policy, and for claims about evidence about scientific claims. Again, it's a strong theory, a restrictive theory. I think that's the way it should be, because both science and evidence-based policy pride themselves on that scientific claims and their hypotheses and the evidence claims and what you're doing is explicit, right? That's the Popperian ideal, and rigorous. And we've got both now.
Thanks.
Sure.
I like that you defended a deductive version of the argument theory of evidence. So the question is rather specific. Well, let's see. So a good argument, a deductively good argument, which gets you to good evidence or good evidence claims, does it contain a ceteris paribus clause explicitly? And if so, what does the clause look like? And do we know that it's true, or do we assume it as true?
Deductive, I don't believe in that was part of, I think, maybe I'm not addressing the right question, but that was part of what I hope to address by mentioning Hempel and thematic arguments. I think, no, there's no ceteris paribus clause in a deductive argument, and I would really much rather, I think there can't be a ceteris paribus clause in an argument that establishes that E is evidence for H. Now, when you give a rendition of an argument to convince me or the scientific community that E is evidence for H, you might leave stuff out. And certainly you're going to have to leave stuff out somewhere in that pyramid. And then you might say those are ceteris paribus clauses. I wouldn't call them that. I'd say they're just premises that where there are gaps. You might fill it in with one. There might be one way to fill it in. There might be another way to fill it in. But there's a gap there. So I wouldn't call them ceteris paribus. I'd call them gaps in the argument. And I like noting that there are always going to be gaps. They're not only that we have fine stopping points. There's always going to be gaps in the argument. And that really matters, because you shouldn't be so confident that you've got evidence when you've got gaps in the arguments. That this just isn't evidence on this account unless there really is an argument, and so it isn't evidence unless there is an argument. Can't be gappy arguments aren't arguments. Now there's an addition, my kind of moral, intellectual demand that you lay out the argument, and then of course you can't really meet that demand, and then there'll be ceteris paribus, something like ceteris paribus clauses, or not ceteris paribus clauses, but there'll be something like, well, I'm not so sure about this premise, but I think we can fill it in some way. Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure. And sometimes, I think that there's been a whole lot of work on robustness, and loosely, right, the kind of general claim that everyone's either attacking or defending or precifying is that that if you've got a whole bunch of, quote, evidence, none of which is sure is evidence or none of which is that points in the same direction, that's better, and the evidence is produced by independent means, that you're much more likely the conclusion to be true. And I think that a version of that is that sometimes we're able to construct a lot of different possibly good arguments. And you think, well, I'm not really sure this is a good argument. I'm not really sure this is a good argument, but I'm pretty sure at least one of them is a good argument. So at least one of them, if one of them is a good argument, then I do have evidence.
Okay, I was given the word. Can you put on the slide close to the end where you compared your reviews with Rausch's? Yeah,
Yes.
yeah. You have in your account that the evidence is true. Now I take it for granted that we agree that no empirical statements we can for certain know is true. Therefore, if I should apply your view in a concrete case, I must say to myself, don't apply it until I have come to the conclusion that I regard the evidence is true. And that's the way to handle it. And then, well, in a way it seems to come pretty close to Rausch's view that the probability of the evidence is high because, since as a philosopher I know that I can't know that it is true, I can only know that it is probably true. So there are, to me, you leave out, so to speak, the personal account. How shall I apply it? Just by saying, in my theory, in your theory, the evidence is true. When I shall apply it, I have to say to myself, I should regard it as true. So could you say some more words about this feature?
Yes. So now I have to stand in the lights, yes. It's just that I can't see people when the lights are shining in my eyes. If I stand, is that okay? Oh, I see. The real light wasn't in my eyes. No, it was in my eyes before. What's happened?
You're looking up. It was.
Ah, thank you. That helps. Well, I was looking up a little bit because I saw some of your faces. I saw people making faces, and someone thought. Yes, I agree that there's first the issue of what is evidence, and then there's the issue of under what conditions am I entitled to think that something is evidence. And I also agree that it's never going to be the case that I could absolutely conclusively know that something's evidence. So there are always going to be two stories. Right? One is what is evidence, and then the other is under what conditions is one entitled to think that there's evidence. Now, people get off and running then on subjective probabilities for this job, but I think it's wrong for this job. So if they get off and running on it for this job, I have got a whole story I don't believe in for why you shouldn't use subjective probabilities there. But that's the job of warranting our knowledge claims. That's exactly the job that Rausch says she's not engaged in and that I'm not engaged in. If you take this as literally doing the job she says, then following your line, right, my epistemic probability has to be not that E. In order for me, right, to be epistemically justified in thinking E is evidence, for me, if I believe the subjective probability stuff, I would say then the epistemic or subjective probability of E is high. For Rausch, you would have to say the epistemic probability is high that the objective probability of E is high, because she's always talking about objective probabilities. And So, I mean, she is literally talking about objective probabilities. And I think that's one of the problems with the account, is that it goes back and forth between half an account about the objective relations that make something evidence, and then slips into aspects of, yes, but evidence is something that we should use. And I'd be very unhappy, at any rate, even, as I said, even in cases where there's objective probabilities, I'd be very unhappy requiring that the objective probability be high for just the kind of cases I cited. Now, if you want to require that I'm not entitled to believe it's evidence without the subjective probability being high, I'm not going to quarrel with that today. Wait a second, please, so I can look at you and get a drink.
Yep.
Yes.
So, the question is about deductive arguments in scientific argument or inference. So there is a well-known critique of Hempel's models by William Drey and Jon Elster and others, that if you want to apply it in the social sciences or in history, you will find that there are very few explanations of that kind. Now, you are not talking about explanations, but you still have the deductive argument patterns. So my worry would be that on your account there is very little evidence in history and social science as well.
Okay.
Is that
a
consequence?
It's a consequence. It's not a consequence that there's very little evidence. It's, of course, a consequence that there's very little stuff that we have very good reason to think is evidence, right? But it's not for the. It's not because of the analog with Hempel, because what goes wrong in the Hempel case is that one of the premises is meant to be a covering law, and we don't have covering laws. But I do think that I have local truths that imply other truths in history, like who. I shouldn't use that example. I'll tell you what I sorry. I'm going to tell you what I thought. Who used up all the loo rolls, the toilet rolls? There were 6 of them in the house last week, and now there's none. Okay, the missing loo rolls make me think that my daughter's come back for a week while I was away. And it's the missing loo rolls are evidence for my daughter's having spent the week there. Why? Well, because here's the deductive argument, right? Emily would have used 6 loo rolls. The house was locked. Nothing was missing from the house. Loo rolls don't self-destruct. Etc. These are the only reasons that the loo rolls could have disappeared. Right? The house was not broken. The house was not broken into. Loo rolls do not self-destruct, etc. The only one that's left is Emily did it, and I like that kind of argument. I like having to insist on you have that in history, because I think it shows how. I mean, as soon as you have to focus on what the missing there, it doesn't have to be, but you focus on what the missing premises are, and then suddenly you say, oh, well, there's something you didn't think of, and that really, those missing. What kind of evidence is that Emily was here? I mean, there's a much more, we would say, plausible explanation. So I think that there are lots of deductive arguments, and historians give something that looks like. They actually have I don't mean have in mind, but that would be reasonable to construct deductive arguments. Whether all the premises are true and one has evidence for all the premises, that's the problem. And I think, I'm going to talk about randomized controlled trials. I mean, I'm only probably just repeating myself. I don't know that I have any arguments for this, but I've been doing a lot of work on causal inference, and in the cases of causal inference, I think in our standard methods that we're happy with for causal inference, and the ones that don't quite do it, but almost do, I think the easy thing to see is that there are fairly straightforward deductive arguments here that really show that if the method could have been carried out in the ideal, the plug was, in the physics examples, the plug really was plugged in, right? That if you could do it in the ideal, then the causal conclusion follows deductively. And in these here, either there's not a deductive argument that you can see, or the deductive argument has such a big missing, premise that's hard to, you can always make a deductive argument, of course, but it would have such an implausible or impossible to take seriously premise that you wouldn't be happy with it as being likely to be a good argument.
Unless I've missed someone, I don't have any more questions on my list. We have plenty of time. Joe? With your slogan, it's not evidence unless there's evidence that there is evidence. I take it as a very nice, catchy slogan. At the same time, of course, there has to be something to prevent an infinite regression. So we don't want it to be the case that, evidence that there's evidence, that's a kind of evidence, so what's the evidence that there's evidence that there's evidence? And you acknowledge, as I understand you, that there are some things that we just take to be evidence. Without pressing further. But I wonder if there isn't more of a threat of something like an infinite regression there than you're quite allowing for.
I think not, because I didn't allow that there are things we just take to be evidence. I allowed there are things we just take to be true. Okay. Now, it's not evidence that there are two things going on, and it's not evidence. It ain't evidence unless there's evidence it's evidence. One is that it just seems to me to follow from the definition, right, that it has to be a premise in a good argument which is true and valid. Okay. Now, when you get down to, I'm sorry, I really messed up about not having the slide with the roots on it. But when you get down to those, if you take them, they're true. After all, at any point, you've got true, and true claims are. This is this trivial thing I mentioned. True claims are always evidence for themselves. So, in a sense, everything has evidence. Every true claim has evidence because it's evidence for itself. And now that's what's the case about what is evidence and what has evidence and what kinds of things are evidence for other things. So in one sense, there isn't evidence unless there's evidence that it's evidence. It follows from the definition, but it's kind of harmless about the state of the world. Right? But when I also then said, I then take it to be a mark of good practice in science and evidence-based policy to lay out these arguments. Okay, that's a separate. That's a one I didn't go into so much, but I think that's what's demanded by claiming that you're doing evidence-based policy and going around strutting around and saying we're really we've got these these rigorous standards and so forth. Which these guys do. There are these evidence hierarchies, and some people have been known to say, if there's with RC randomized controlled trials at the top. And some people have been known to say, look, you can array all the putative evidence there is below that, but it's not evidence. Nothing but RCTs are evidence. And once you've seen what RCTs, don't look at anything else. That's stupid. Okay. So those guys have very high standards of rigor and something. Right? And if you're going to have those high standards, then I say, it's part of the game that you be explicit and rigorous, and so you should lay out these argument pyramids. That's the game, and that's what you should be doing, and it's culpable not to do that. Now, at that point, we get to the possibility of an epistemic infinite regress, and then you do just, I think, you do have to epistemically plump. Right? You say, okay, this is true. That's my stopping point. Right? Where I take this is true, so I'm entitled to take everything from there up.
Or I believe this is true.
Yes.
The other concern I have, which is possibly related, is that I think oftentimes when we're evaluating arguments, we have this notion of a gold standard being mathematical proofs. And I think whenever we're doing arguments in any other field than very formal mathematics, that it gets very problematic to say what is a valid argument and what's not.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, so deduction is the standard, but it's sometimes hard to evaluate if you're not using just ordinary kind of Aristotelian logic, right? Because I think predicate calculus is a sort of silly. I mean, it doesn't render what we do in ordinary language. And it is interesting. I find interesting that my economist colleagues feel that they're dreadfully rigorous because they do all this mathematics. And now, if you go to an economics theory seminar, you have to be a really good game theoretician, not just a good economist. You have to be good at a certain kind of funny mathematics, and they, fancy kinds of game theory. Now they pride themselves on their rigor, but if you then ever actually look at it, once you get outside the tiny little model, they're just have no rigor at all in the way they talk, and it's very difficult to reconstruct anything that looks like a rigorous argument. I don't know whether that reinforces your point, that it's...
I'm not sure either, but I'm inclined to agree about the economists.
Yes.
Thanks.
Yeah.
I don't think we have any more questions, so thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Thank you all.